Today, we have a special program about the Great Depression, in which we will be talking about the people affected by this occurrence, as well as the efforts made by the presidents to mitigate the repercussions. Okay, let's get started.
Unemployment rates are at an all-time high, and many families have been left homeless in the wake of this economic depression. Today, we will examine the causes that have led us to this tragedy. Just a few years ago, corporate profits soared and business became bigger and bigger. Instead of paying workers more with their surplus wealth, corporations continued expanding and working on ways to produce more goods more efficiently. This left less money in the hands of the people, who often couldn't afford the products they were buying. Individual consumers began raking in large amounts of debt, even though they often couldn't afford to pay it back. The very unequal distribution of wealth stopped purchasing because the rich saved more than they needed to, because they already had what they needed, while the middle class did not have money to buy the things that they needed and wanted. Issues with corruption, greed, and mismanagement in the banking system led to banks making speculative investments, leaving no room for banks to set things right if they failed. Businesses
remained unchecked, and no government agency monitored the stock exchanges. This caused insider stock trading, shady deals, and fraud all through the stock market. Businesses became so successful that they no longer needed loans and ruled the country only by looking out for their own interest. Industries became sick due to overexpansion, causing many people to lose their jobs. Due to increased supply and demand, many farmers failed and took with them the banks that had once lent them money. These are just some of the problems that have caused the severe economic depression of today.
The Depression has greatly affected many groups of people, which prompted them to completely change aspects of their lives. For example, marriages and births plummeted. Young couples postponed having children, and some families grew closer in hard times. Others fell apart. Divorces declined, but desertion, the poor man's divorce, was common. Men and women were individually affected as well. Men whose lives had been dominated by work had nothing to do and grew depressed. Women stayed home, kept household budgets in order, canned more food, and made cheaper substitutes. Yet, women outside of the home faced prejudice that forced them into traditional women's spheres, such as that of school teachers and secretaries. Farmers also faced debilitating effects as they were forced to abandon their farms as a result of various dust storms. Many of them migrated to California. Minorities experienced many tribulations as well. Mexicans were also often discriminated against. The government launched a series of deportations, or reparations, which sent Mexicans back to Mexico. Mexican communities shrank, and Mexican-American children did not go to school. The flow of African-American migrants from the Deep South dropped drastically with the beginning of the Depression. Standouts such as George Baker refused to be victimized by the Depression, which inflamed racial prejudice. Numbers of lynching increased. People sought reassurance of past American practices and things that made them feel comfortable. Nearly every family owned a radio, and people relied on them to keep connected to the world around them. Sporting News had found some new fans created by radio. Women, husbands began taking wives and daughters to sporting events after radio sparked interest. Commercialism rose. Advertisers advertised products on popular shows. Radio bound people together because whoever you were, wherever you were, you could listen to the same radio show as anyone else. No social, economic, or political boundaries. Now to Emerson, with an exclusive thoughts on what Hoover planned for relief and an interview with the former president himself.
This is Emerson Thomas coming to you live from APUSH News, Mod 1617. Today, our main topic of discussion is the one and only great humanitarian, Herbert Hoover himself. Now, during the Depression, relief organizations have too little money and not enough resources to effectively help those who are struggling financially. Although some ethnic charities like to give aid like social support, life insurance, sickness benefits, and necessities like food and clothing to their members, these efforts were ultimately failing. City treasuries went nearly bankrupt because money was being given to the needy on top of having to pay taxes that were already late. So some cities actually refused to give money to those who didn't have children. Cities also asked for help from state capitals, but they didn't have any money either because of excessive spending and a lack of record keeping. So ultimately, no states had any agencies to handle unemployment. 1930 marked the start of Hoover's presidency, that he had more vigor and compassion than any other president known. When the Depression struck, although past presidents believed that intervention by government would disrupt the natural working of the economy, and their only responsibility was to balance the budget, Hoover understood that the correlation between unemployment and consumer demand, and he set in place programs to stimulate investment. But ultimately, Hoover's programs failed. He rallied business leaders who promised to keep employees, but ultimately they panicked when the economy worsened. He had a tax cut to increase the purchasing power of consumers, but changed course when cuts produced an unbalanced federal budget. He believed capitalism would generate on its own recovery, and a balanced federal budget was needed to restore business. And he also had tax increases that undermined investment and consumption. Hoover supported the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which was meant to protect the United States from cheaper foreign goods, but other nations retaliated against this, which slowed world trade and reduced American sales overseas. Hoover spent about $1 billion on public works, but this money didn't do much to help the unemployed. He was pressured by Congress to allow the birth of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation because a huge number of banks were closing due to depositors withdrawing their fund. This corporation had a stock of $500 million and also had the power to borrow 4 times that amount. In 3 weeks, bank failures went from 70 banks per week to about 1 bank per week, and this was considered a success. He was criticized for helping only the banks and not the people. Hoover didn't want federal relief for the unemployed because he thought a giveaway program would ruin the initiative of recipients and produce a permanent lower class. He assumed being neighborly and working together would suffice. As unemployment worsened, he allowed Congress to pass the Emergency Relief and Construction Act, which allowed the RFC to lend up to $1.5 billion to public works that would generate revenue, like toll bridges and slum clearance. $300 million went to states for loaning to the unemployed. This was ultimately not successful because there was not enough money, so it could only send states a very small amount. During this time, discontent was rising from groups such as Wisconsin dairy farmers who overturned tens of thousands of milk cans and miners on strike known as the Coal Caravan. They drove through Illinois. There were also marchers that stormed Henry Ford's plants and were attacked by police. At the end of the day, 4 marchers were dead and 20 were wounded. The Communist Party at this time called for collectivism and an end to capitalism, but there were only 20,000 members, so there was not enough to revolt. Another source of discontent was from a group known as the Bonus Army. They were World I veterans who wanted to cash in bonus certificates they had received by fighting in the war. When they arrived in Washington, D.C., they numbered about 20,000 people. This was known as the largest march in the city's history. Hoover dismissed them as a special interest lobby and refused to see the leaders. The Senate blocked the bonus bill, so only 2,000 people stayed. They camped with their families and paraded peacefully. When they refused to leave after police tried to evict them in July, Hoover called the U.S. Army under General Douglas MacArthur, who brought 4 troops of cavalry with sabers, 6 tanks, and a column of infantry with bayonets. Overnight, marchers left except for 300 wounded veterans. Hoover accepted the responsibility for American troops acting unarmed and unemployed veterans. The election of 1932 was Herbert Hoover, the Republican, versus Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Democrat. During this election, Roosevelt did something unusual. He flew to Chicago and addressed the delegates in person, and he also went everywhere to appeal to the broadest possible amount of voters. What? Ladies and gentlemen, we have a very special guest, Herbert Hoover himself. How are you doing, sir?
Hello.
Hello. Um, wow, this is such an honor. I don't even know what to say. Can you tell us what Franklin Delano Roosevelt called for in his plan for presidency?
Well, he called for multiple things like a balanced budget, costly public works, and aid to the employed. He wanted to help businesses and then wanted to remember the forgotten man and distribute products and wealth more equally.
Wow, thanks. And what exactly do you think about the New Deal?
Well, I denounce the New Deal. It has a dangerous departure from traditions and it will destroy the values and institutions of America. We need to build a bureaucracy.
Well, thanks. During Election Day, Roosevelt had 50% of the popular vote and a large amount of Democrats in Congress. Who exactly was Roosevelt supported by?
He was supported by industrial workers in the North, poor farmers in the South and West, immigrants, and big city dwellers. They all gathered together.
Well, these people all experienced the horrors of boom and bust cycles, and they wanted change. They followed Roosevelt and the Democrats, who knew that in a modern state, it was not enough to center around business and hope capitalism would fix itself. This has been Emerson Thomas for APUSH News. Thank you, Mr. Hoover, for joining us today. Peace out.